that it will be available online. And like I said, these videos aren't massively super high traffic, but people do watch them. So I'm Michael Strauss. I'm a associate professor of political science at TCU, and I'm also the director of Asian Studies. And so this is the fourth lecture in our TCU Asian Studies Zoom lecture series this year. So one of the few good things that's come out of COVID is we've gotten to bring more people into campus because we can bring them in from all over. So this is, like I said, this is our fourth lecture. And our speaker is Dr. Allison Alexy. I'm going to introduce her in just a minute, but I also want to tell you, if you have questions, as she said, she's happy to answer questions during her talk. So if you want to ask a question, you can click the little hand raise, or you can type it into the chat, or you can save it for the end. And at the end, you can either type your question in and she'll look at it and I'll read it to her or she'll read it. Or if you just type your name, we'll call on you. So if you'd rather say your question, just type your name and I'll call on you and you can say your question. So Dr. Allison Alexy is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures and the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. And she's the director of undergraduate studies at the Center for Japanese Studies. She's the author of a book that came out last year called Intimate Disconnections, Divorce and the Romance of Independence in Contemporary Japan. It's published with University of Chicago Press. And she's co-edited two books, Intimate Japan, Ethnographies of Closeness and Conflict, and Home and Family in Japan, Continuity and Transformation. She's currently working on a book, which I think she'll talk a little, or at least maybe allude to some of it today, called Family Law in a Family Nation, Parental Abductions and Activism in Contemporary Japan. And I think she's the first of the four people that we brought in that actually hosts a podcast. So she's the host of the Michigan Talks Japan podcast, which is really great. There aren't a ton of episodes, but when they bring speakers to the University of Michigan, she interviews them, and they're really great. I've known Dr. Alexy, I think, since 2005, when we were both graduate students and we were in Japan together, both on the same fellowship researching our dissertations. And I definitely remember, I have like one specific memory of that time where the whole group of graduate students were all gathered and we were all complaining about human subjects, this thing we had to do to basically get permission to do research, on people. And we were all very bitter graduate students. And Allison just stepped in and she had this, she was just so much more mature than the rest of us. And she kind of, gently explained, well, I hear these complaints, but there's actually a very good reason for these human subjects protocols. And she was totally right. And I feel like she's always just been sort of much more sort of mature and like a good role model for the rest of us. And she continues to be so. So I'm really delighted we can have Dr. Alexy to campus. I wish we could have her here in person, maybe sometime in the next few years, but for now we'll have to be okay with Zoom. So welcome, Dr. Alexy.
Thank you, Dr. Strauss. That's so nice of you. At the same time that I feel like you kind of set me up because now I have to pretend to be mature for this entire presentation, which is not usually my game plan. So perhaps we can understand that I spent all my maturity credits in that one interaction with you in Japan 15 years ago, and they are gone now. Thank you for that really generous introduction. It's been a pleasure to know you and to encounter you here in Ann Arbor and invite you to Michigan. And now it's really my pleasure to join you and to meet all of you. I know that people, I'll speak for myself, I am tired of Zoom and tired in general. So I really, really appreciate you tuning into this. I would be very happy to make this as much of a conversation as you would like. So that's not to put stress on any of you, but I would really, truly appreciate it if you would raise your hand and make a comment or ask a question kind of in the middle. I think that the best thing to do in this kind of moment is to embrace where we are, embrace how we're feeling, and like make it as fun as we possibly can. If we can call a conversation about child custody fun. So let me get started by sharing my screen with you. Just give me 1 second. Oops. Fabulous. Okay, I think you can see my screen, right? Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about part of my book, and it's actually from a chapter that's titled Families Together and Apart, Divorce and Child Custody in Contemporary Japan. And I just wanted to, Dr. Strauss had already given you this information, but This is a volume that I co-edited with Emma E. Cook. And it is also available through open access. I think you probably know what this means, but let me just explain it. That means that some organization has paid the press to make a free, basically PDF that's available on the internet. So it's totally legal. It's totally fair to get. So you can buy a copy of the book if you want to, like a paperback copy, but I don't think you need to do that. If you're interested, you can also download the PDF. And I have a link that I'll drop into the chat in 1 second. Here it is. So I'm going to drop three links into the chat all at once. So the first one there is this Intimate Japan volume. The second one is my book, and the third one is this podcast that you already heard a little bit about. I feel kind of mortified to have a podcast, but I also do have a podcast. So I feel like I might as well own it and tell you that I have a podcast. So it's called Michigan Talks Japan. It is me kind of having long form interviews with scholars of Japan from all different fields and different backgrounds. There's a link in the chat right now for the podcast so you can download. I think we have like 8 or 9 episodes at this point. We have another few coming out. So it's been a really fun learning experience. And the reason that Professor Strauss knows about the podcast is because he was on the podcast. So this is us. Look how few masks we're wearing. Isn't it amazing to look back at pictures? look how close we are. Could you imagine? So this is Dr. Strauss and one of my research assistants named Jordan Cleland recording his episode, which I thought was really great. I really learned a lot from your book. I really enjoyed our conversation. And actually it gets, part of your book gets cited in later conversations as well. Levy McLaughlin, I think or someone else was also talking about, oh no, it's Suma Ikeuchi who's talking about immigration to Japan. That's what it was. So here's a little flashback for you all. So please listen if you want, no pressure, and I really would be happy to get any comments or feedback you care to share with me. So this is the book that I published about a year ago that was already introduced. It is also available through open access. Open access is a term that can describe multiple different processes to get that PDF book to readers. So the link is different. It's through a different source, but this is the second link in the chat if you want to download the whole book. Again, totally legal, totally valid. Like it's all there. It's not like it's only part of it. I'm excited about this because I wrote the book to be accessible. I was trying to write it in a way that non-specialists would be able to engage it. I'm not saying I necessarily succeeded, but that was one of my goals, one of my intentions. So I would be very happy if you have time to engage it, just pick it up. It's free, right? So you can pick it up and just read a part and then send me a comment or some feedback if you want. So today what I'm going to be doing is drawing from the 4th chapter of this book, which is about child custody. So the book overall is about divorce in contemporary Japan. So I did participant observation and field work with people starting from 2005 and going through 2013. So really intensively for 1 year and then back many summers and sort of touching base with people that I knew. I would be very happy to talk about my research methodology. I'm also happy to talk about what anthropologists call positionality. And so that's who I am as a person, so the body I'm in. I'm a white American woman. I'm actually really tall. You can't probably tell right now. So I have an American accent, like all of these things. I have an American accent when I speak English. I have an American accent when I speak Japanese, right? All of these things. And so sometimes people are really curious about how I was able to do research about a topic that might be maybe a little touchy or personal or private or stigmatizing. So I'm happy to talk more about any of that at any point. You're welcome to interrupt me. But for now, what I'll do, the overall argument of the book is that when we're thinking about divorce in Japan, when Japanese people are thinking about divorce in the current moment, one of the things they're contemplating is how connection can be a good thing or a bad thing in different kinds of relationships, right? So when people are deciding, should I get divorced or does my spouse want to divorce me, right? Am I about to get left? Part of what they're talking about and they're debating and they're discussing with their friends and in media is what makes a good relationship and what makes a bad relationship. And part of what I'm arguing in the book is that one of the sort of key measures of what makes a good relationship or a bad relationship hinges on connection and independence. right? Or connection and dependence. To what degree can you be in a relationship that is connected in a certain way so that it's good for you? It's by whatever, sort of subjective definition you have. It's a good marriage. It's a good relationship. What makes some connections good and what makes some connections bad or poisonous or toxic? Any of those kinds of words. So that's kind of the overall argument of the book. And what I would like to talk to you about today is how this translates into child custody decisions. So the main take-home point that if you forget everything else about this presentation, please remember that I'm supposedly mature, or I was once mature for 15 years ago, right? And then second, as a major take-home point, that there are really a lot of debates and discussions about what is best in child custody relationships. So I don't want you to think that there is a singular, sort of Japanese model for how to handle child custody. That is not the case at all. And I want to kind of break down what people are debating. But broadly, what they're debating is basically what's good for children and what kinds of connections or disconnections between mostly parents and children are good for children, right? So when parents get divorced and the children are, inevitably impacted by that, what kinds of connections or disconnections are better for children? And this is a debate. This is a pretty serious debate at the moment. So let me start by giving you a little bit of a sense of the divorce rate. So the dotted line at the top is the crude marriage rate. So you can see that the number of people getting married, right? The number of marriages has decreased. So this goes, in case you can't see it, from 1947 until 2015. So starting in sort of going down into the 1980s, and it's decreasing a little bit, but the marriage rate is pretty steady right now. Similarly, the divorce rate, the crude divorce rate, is the darker line at the bottom, and it's sort of gone up and down, but about 1/3 of Japanese marriages will end in divorce in the current moment. So it's decreased a little bit since a high of 2003. For whatever it's worth, I started this research in 2005. So by accident, in a way that I didn't realize at the time, I was sort of coming in at the tail end of this like little divorce. It's not quite a spike, but like a little hill. The gray bars behind it all are the total number of divorces. So you can see that even given the divorce rate is, pretty steady, the number of divorces has increased. That's just because of the population, right? So there are more people in these years. Another graph, I thought I would give you two graphs right at the beginning. So this is a representation of who gets custody after divorce in Japan. So the most important fact to know is that at the moment in Japan, there is no legal joint custody after divorce. So if parents get divorced and they have a child, that child's custody must be held by only one person. It does not have to be a parent. It could be a grandparent. It could, in theory, be someone else, right? But it can't be jointly held in the way that I think many people in the US maybe take for granted. That is a relatively new thing, really only since the late 60s have American judges and the American family law system pushed the idea that joint custody is better for children. One of the debates that's going on right now in Japan is joint custody actually better for children, right? So part of, if that is your instinct, I totally support that idea. I think I understand why your instinct is parents or children should see both of their parents. But I ask you to hold that just for maybe 10 or 15 minutes while I try to explain the other logic, right? Explain the logic of why some people who do mean well, you don't have to agree with them, but some people think that it might be better in some situations for children not to see one parent, right? So what we see in this graph is a shift from that sole custody being awarded to fathers. So on the left side of the graph here is 1950, going again until 2015. And if the graph extended further back, the trend lines would also continue. So in 1950, husbands were more likely to be awarded custody. In 1920, they were even more likely, for instance, to be awarded custody. And by today, more than 80% of child custody after divorce in Japan is awarded to mothers. So we see a really big shift in who is getting legal custody. What I've also included here. So yellow is mothers, right? So you can see how many more mothers are getting custody. The red bars that are getting smaller and smaller are another person. So someone who is not the legal mother or father getting custody. And then the gray bar is just the total number of divorces involving children, right? So something like 60% of divorces in Japan right now involve children. And the key number here is more than 80% of custody is granted to mothers. Let me pause there and ask if there are any questions so far. If you can raise your digital hand, or you could put your name in the chat if you want. Annie, please.
Was there any like specific reason why the fathers were getting custody, and like what made the like such a like in 1970 the quick turnaround to mothers?
Absolutely, it's such a great question. Thank you for asking. Yes, so the answer is because of the patriarchal understanding of family lineage. So when parents get divorced, say in, I don't know, 1920s Japan, and earlier too, historically earlier, the expectation was that those children, quote unquote, belonged to the husband's family, right? So it wasn't so much that the husband was getting custody because he was the children's father. It was more like he was getting custody because those children belonged to his lineage, right? So the ie, the family line or the stem family line. And so his lineage, those children needed to be in his lineage, and he was kind of the representative of that lineage. I haven't been able to prove this, so I haven't written it as much as I would like, but I strongly suspect, and I have some evidence, but not quite enough yet, that much of the time when fathers were granted custody in these earlier moments, they weren't actually taking care of the children in the way that we might think what custody means, right? They were giving those children, I mean, they're still loving the children and supporting them, right? But then what's actually happening is some of their female relatives, so the children's aunts, the children's grandmothers, are actually taking care of the children. So it was really more of a lineage, sort of the extended family project, as opposed to a single dad, something like that. Does that answer your question, Annie?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for asking. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Michael.
One thing that's been in the news a lot that we've talked about in my politics of Japan class is the fufu bese debate. So the debate about couples being able to be married with different last names. And I was wondering if the debate about permitting sort of joint custody maps onto that fufu bese debate, or if people who believe one way about marriage with different last names tend to believe the same way about custody.
That's such a good question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is the fufu bese debate, or the issue. So this issue that's about, for people who don't know, legally in Japan, when two people get married, and the only legal marriage in Japan right now is between two people who are legally not the same gender, right? So we can also talk about gay relationships, gay marriage, and the push for that. So there's a whole bunch of different sort of activist issues, and one is for same-sex marriage, but this really massive issue around last names. So when two people get married legally in Japan, they have to have the same last name. Since the post-war constitution, that last name is not required to be the husband's last name, but in something like 97% of the cases, it is the husband's last name. It's very, very unusual not to have a married woman not have her husband's last name. It's weird to have your name automatically be changed anywhere, but I think it's especially weird in Japan because growing up, you get called your last name a lot more. I didn't get called Alexy, for instance, in class. You know what I mean? Like I got called Allison as I was in elementary school and up through high school. And like Allison is what my friends call me and what my family calls me. But in Japan, in lots of situations, you actually get called by your last name, or maybe a nickname derived from your last name. So it's not uncommon even for friends to use something like that. I say this to say, therefore, when you get married and your last name changes, for the women who change their names, it's really alienating, right? It's a loss of identity. And there's lots of great, I'm sure you're talking about this in your class, there's lots of great writing right now, especially about this issue. So that issue is such a big one that more people know about it, more people talk about it. I think custody is increasingly becoming an issue, but it's just not as well known. So I think if there is an overlap, to answer your question, I think if there's an overlap, it's just because the fuhu bese issue is so big and like takes up so much space, like as well it should, because it's a pretty easy fix. I mean, there's a lot of easy fixes here, but custody, fewer people I think actually know in Japan that there is no joint custody. One of the groups I worked with, and I have pictures here later in the presentation I'm happy to share with you. One of the things they're doing is setting up like little information tables next to train stations to inform people that there's no joint custody and that these kinds of things, these kinds of custodial arrangements happen in Japan. So it's just really kind of informational. Does that answer your question, Nicole? Okay, thank you. All right, so let me start with an example that's sort of famous and sort of not. How many of you, I wish I could do a poll, I hadn't thought about it. Did anyone know that Koizumi, so this is Koizumi Junichiro, the person on the left, who you probably recognize. He was a very famous prime minister of Japan, and he's still a pretty famous politician. He was from the Liberal Democratic Party, which is of course the conservative party, right? They are not progressive. And he was also not a particularly progressive prime minister, but he was very popular. He got married to a woman named Miyamoto Kayoko in 1978, and they very quickly had 2 children. When you do the math, the first son was born less than 9 months after their marriage, so we can make a pretty good guess that this was what would be called in English, sort of old-timey English, a shotgun marriage, or in Japanese, dekichatta kekkon, which is fine, no judgment there, totally fine, whatever you want to do. They had a second son named Shinjiro. And then, so these 2 sons now are also maybe recognizable celebrities to you. So one is an actor who's pretty famous, and one is a politician who's pretty famous and quite successful. And Kayoko was actually pregnant with their 3rd child, who was ultimately born in 1983, when Koizumi asked for a divorce, requested a divorce, and he got custody of the 2 older sons. He actually tried to get custody of the 3rd son, but was unsuccessful because that son had not yet been born. So she was still carrying the 3rd son. And so she had custody of the 3rd son. She agreed to the divorce. They got divorced. And then kind of interestingly for our purposes, famously, Koizumi has never met the 3rd son, and she has not seen the 2 sons that he got custody of. So this is an instance of what I call a clean break in divorce. So the idea that a non-custodial parent should not see their child after divorce. I use this as an example, partially because it's kind of extreme, and partially because, well, it's not extreme. It might seem extreme, let me say it that way. And partially because Koizumi is such a famous politician, and also a conservative politician. So you would think that if there was a problem with this kind of model for custody, his political career would have been impacted by it, right? What I find is that when I bring it up with people, they definitely know he got divorced, but they're like, yeah, this is just sort of the way it goes, right? So what I'm trying to argue in the chapter is that this clean break model for custody after divorce remains a recognizable norm. So I'm not arguing that everyone does this or that everyone thinks it's a good idea. But in Japan, to this day, it remains a recognizable norm that some people think there are real benefits to this kind of model. So even as practices and norms shift, this clean break remains a legal standard. What this means is, in the way you get divorced in Japan, legally speaking, is that the partners get a pretty simple form. It's like 2 pages or so. You fill out the form, you both sign the form, you both stamp the form, and you submit the form. So if you can get your spouse to agree, if you want a divorce, if I want a divorce and I can get my husband to agree to that divorce, we can completely facilitate that divorce on our own. We fill out the form and we turn it in. You don't have to go in front of a judge. You don't have to explain the reasons. You don't have to pay a lot of money, right? So in some ways, it's a relatively simple legal process. in that process, if you have children, there is literally a box to check. And the form has changed slightly, but there is a box to check that says who will have custody of the child. And so this clean break remains the legal standard. If part of what I'm arguing in the book is that lots of parents have figured out ways to have a relationship between the non-custodial parent and the child after divorce. So even though there's a model of a clean break, only about a third of families choose, in my research, choose that path, right? So it's not a majority, but it is a recognizable norm. So what I found was that if parents are able to work out another agreement, great. No one will stop them. So if I say have legal custody of a child, and I negotiate a relationship with my ex-husband and he sees the kid, once a month or whatever on the holidays, no one will stop you. Annie, yeah, go ahead.
Is the 1/3 is the group that does the clean break, or does where the child can see the non-custodial parent?
Thank you for asking. I basically found 3 patterns, and I have a slide about this in a few seconds, so it might make it more clear. I found sort of 3 patterns, and the clean break is one of those patterns. And I found they were kind of in practice, they were equal. So like there's 3 types of ways of handling custody after divorce, and each one of them is about a third. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, it was confusing. It'll be easier when you see it in text, maybe. So what I'm trying to say here is that if parents can agree to share custody in practical terms, the law is not going to step in and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Totally fine. But what's tricky and why this matters is, but if parents need help from the legal system is always going to use the clean break as the necessary solution. So if you have to go and get help from the legal system, if you need a kind of legal counseling, if you have a disagreement, if your ex-husband is no longer paying child support and you're trying to get him to do that, if you do any kind of work within the formal legal system, family law system in Japan, the model of clean break is what they're going to be pushing you towards, right? So this is one place where it still really has a lot of influence. Okay, excuse me, Annie, let me lay this out now more clearly for you in the text in slides. So what I found in my research was that, if you look just at law, it looks really simple. No shared custody, no joint custody, none of that. But what anthropologists do, of course, is actually see how people live, the choices they make, right? And what I found is that people are, of course, more diverse, making more diverse choices than we might expect looking only at the law. So there's the clean break model. So that absolutely exists, and about a third of people with whom I did research actually made that choice. Everybody recognizes it as a thing, right? But lots of people are like, no, that's not the right choice. Like, that's not right for my kid, or that's not right for my family. The second pattern I found, and I think this is actually a relatively significant finding in the book, even if it might sound incredibly obvious, is that about a third of families are doing what I call de facto shared custody. So even though, legally speaking, there is no joint custody, one parent, say the mom, legally has custody of the child, for whatever reason, and I'll give you some examples in a second, the parents say, no, it's really important for our kid to see both of us, right? Both their mom and their dad. And so what I found was that plenty of families, not a significant majority, but plenty of families have de facto shared custody. So in practice, they're able to share custody. The third category is what I call a contested clean break. So this is a situation where one parent wants to make a clean break. So usually the custodial parent wants to make a clean break and say, no, I have custody of the child, you can't see them anymore, right? But that other parent, the non-custodial parent, actually would still like to have contact. They would like to have some kind of de facto shared custody. Jonah, please.
Yes, so those graphs that you showed earlier with the statistics of, we saw the mother stats going up. Yes. So with those 3 categories, does this graph include all of those, or is this just the contested clean breaks?
This is just This is actually none of those categories. This is sort of all of them together, right? So this is who gets legal custody. So some of these people will be having what I call de facto shared custody. So even though the mom, say, has legal custody, she will let, the child see their father. Some of these would be clean breaks. So the mother has custody, the child never sees the non-custodial dad, and some of them could be a contested clean break, right? So this is just an overall picture. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. And the third, the reason it's sort of rounded too is because I'm an ethnographer, right? And I'm not doing some kind of big survey research. I have some in the book, certainly I do have survey research, not that I did, but that I'm citing, because I wanted to make sure that what I was seeing was not just like an anomaly, right? So I think that there are generational differences in these choices, there are regional differences, there's all sorts of differences, but I think I'm not wrong to say that all three of these types exist, certainly. Does that answer, Jonah? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So let me just give you some examples here. This is a person. All the names, of course, have been changed. This is a young woman named that I'm calling Miho. When she was like 6 or 7 years old, and her parents were married, and her father came home one day. This is the story that I was told. Her father came home one day and said, I've been having a relationship with a coworker. I want a divorce. So her mother, this was in the early 90s, her mother agreed to the divorce because she's like, well, what's the point of this? Like, I don't want a bad marriage. And Miho then, her custody went to her mother. So she also has an older brother. And in this time, because of the way the family registry system works in Japan, her mother's last name changed. And then Miho's last name had to change as well, right? Because they're on the same family registry. So they legally have to have the same last name. This matters because what it did was make it clear to the people in her school that something had happened in her family and probably her parents had gotten divorced. So other students at her school, which was in Tokyo, started bullying her. And of course, I don't know if I should say of course, but there's a lot of discourse about bullying and harassment in Japanese schools. Certainly there was in the 1990s as well. Miho, when she was talking to me about it, she really pinned this to her family, her parents' divorce, and saying, well, if my name hadn't changed, then, they wouldn't have bullied me. At the same time that, like, we can't actually know that that was true. It strikes me that, I don't mean to sound silly about it, but like, if kids want to be mean, they can find kind of anything to be mean about, you know what I mean? And this was the thing that they gravitated to with her. So what's important for our story here is that after her parents' divorce, Miho has never seen her father again. So she was about 7 and she had been, perfectly close to her father. He worked, he was a salaryman, but she never saw him again. This was a clean break. And I spent a lot of time with her and wanted to know really if she thought this was a good idea, if she thought this was the right thing. And the way she explained it to me was, well, she would like to have a relationship with like a nice father, or a nice person. But by virtue of the fact that her father has never reached back out to her, he must not be a nice person. And so therefore she was okay with the clean break. Like, it must have been the right choice is what I call this section in the chapter. And I wanted to just spend a little bit of time of sort of talking through that logic. It's tricky logic. One of the things that I don't mean like she's tricking me. I just mean it's complicated to try to figure out, would I want a relationship with this person who seems to not want a relationship with me, even though for those of us who might be parents in this conversation, or maybe even not, you can also imagine that the father might think that he is doing the right thing by not sort of interrupting her life, right? So again, I want to just ask you in a friendly way, if you think this sounds nuts, if you think this sounds like a terrible, terrible idea, try to imagine very rational, very caring and loving people who think that this is the right way to handle a really difficult situation, right? So the logic there is, I think in general, I'm going to speak in very general terms, Americans are accepting of the labor of shared custody. So I don't know how many of you have divorced parents or have friends who have divorced parents. It takes a lot to share custody, right? Like there's all this scheduling. There's all this scheduling. You're like, and I don't know if you had it, but I certainly remember growing up with friends who were like, oh no, today is Tuesday, so I'm at my dad's house, but tomorrow is Wednesday, so I need to get this outfit and I have to remember my field hockey uniform. Like there's all of this scheduling that happens when children are moving between two households. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that in general, I think Americans kind of miss noticing. They fail to notice all of that work. The other kind of work that I think Americans aren't great at noticing is what it feels like, or it could feel like to a child. Say parents get divorced, father starts dating someone new, and the child forms a relationship with not his stepmother, right? Or their stepmother, but their dad's girlfriend, right? And then things happen and those two break up, right? And there's like, okay, so that child has formed a relationship and now that child has to handle this other kind of breakup. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying I don't think Americans pay a lot of attention to all of that work, all of that emotional labor, right? All of the time and energy it takes to do these kinds of things. In the model of the clean break, the logic is it is going to be awful. This is really a terrible thing to separate a child from their parent. But it is a wound that will heal. And if we have to have shared custody, it'll be like a scab that's getting picked open again and again and again. There's no space for healing in that way. So I just want to put that in your mind. Again, I'm not actually arguing that this is always right, but if part of what I'm trying to say is that people are debating the value of connection and disconnection, and this is one of the places, right? So does continued connection between a non-custodial parent and their child help or hurt that child, right? This is one of the ways that people are debating it. Let me pause there and ask for any comments or questions. You can also just like vent if you're having an emotional reaction. You're like, this is mean, I don't like this. Jonah, yeah.
I was just wondering about, so you said that the parents getting divorced, they can do this on their own. Like there's a document that they can fill out and they don't have to go to court unless it's contested. Is that right? Okay, so does that save them money when they can just agree outside of the court? Like how does like economic status play in here?
It saves money compared with the American example because that means you don't have to pay for a lawyer. So in that way, but there's also, and I go into this in a great deal in the chapter as well, if you're interested in reading about it, there is, what chapter is it? I think it's actually chapter 5 in the book. So it's not this chapter, but one of the implications of these seemingly easy divorces is that it means one partner can sort of bribe or harass or harangue the other partner into the agreement, right? So we can imagine that it's also a space ripe for, I don't want to say abuse, but pressure, right? So say if I'm in a marriage that I really want to end, I might be inclined to make no demands on my husband because I just want the marriage to be over, particularly let's imagine if it's violent, right? Or if I'm suffering some kind of abuse or surviving some kind of abuse. So there are many situations, I think, where in practice, the spouse who wants the divorce, who wants to get out of there, will basically agree to not ask for anything, right? So they might end up losing a lot of money, whether that's in terms of property, whether that's in terms of other things. So I think it's chapter 5 of the book. It's called The Cost of Divorce. And I'm trying to write about how, basically to sort of answer your question.
Great, thank you.
Okay, absolutely. So there's a wonderful term that a sociologist named Shinji Nozawa came up with called scrap and build families to describe this, what I'm calling the clean break. So scrap and build, if you don't know, is a construction term to describe the way that buildings and especially houses in Japan are built and then rebuilt. So what you do is, this is a picture of a house that's in the midst of being scrapped and rebuilt. So land in Japan is very expensive, but the houses are worth less, much less. So for instance, you probably aren't going to, there's not a huge market for like used housing in Japan. There's market for land. And then say you buy a house and it's, I don't know, 30 or 40 years old. And if you can afford it, what you're going to do is raise it, right? So knock down the whole house and then rebuild a new house right on that same property. And this is called scrap and build. So you scrap the old house and you rebuild on the same land. And what Nozawa is doing is using this as a really lovely analogy to describe the way that people are imagining the best way to have families. So if you have a marriage, you have, let's say, a first marriage, and you have children in that marriage, some people who subscribe to this clean break model then basically scrap that family, and apologies for the harsh language, scrap that family and build a new family. So rather than having a kind of blended family relationship, which is what I would imagine many Americans think is kind of normal, they're saying, no, it's not, that's not the right way to do it. We don't want to have these kinds of complicated mixed relationships between, you know, my half sister and my stepsister and my stepmom and my step grandmom, and there's all these people, right? So this model of scrap and build families is what I'm trying to articulate with the clean break. So let me just give you, Michael, what do we think about time? Should I wrap up soon?
So like I said, normally we've been going for an hour to an hour and 15. So
Okay.
maybe 10 or 15 more, and then some time for Q&A, if that
Yes.
works for you. Yeah.
Totally fine. Yeah, I wanted to check in. Thank you very much. So I'll just say very briefly, give you two other examples. So this also comes from the book, and you are welcome to read more if you care to. So Wada-san is a woman who had been married and then divorced. And Okada-san is her partner now, who's a man who was in the same situation, so married and divorced. And these are people who, I should also say, Wada-san and Okada-san have not remarried. They're not particularly interested in being married to each other, but they've been partners for something like 12 or 15 years when I met them. They each have children. Wada-san has one daughter. Okada-san has 2 or 3 daughters. I forget right now. And to my mind, as a researcher studying this stuff, they have one of the most blended families that I've encountered in Japan. But what's interesting too is that they're not maybe quite as blended as you might expect. So Wada-san got divorced because her husband was sort of like never around and was really, to her mind, treating her like a maid. And when they got divorced, their daughter was still an infant. And Wada-san, this is in the late 80s. Wada-san thought, well, you know, it's important for my daughter to have a relationship with her father, and navigated that. So the ex-husband, continued to make payments, basically child support alimony payments, which he would pay by electronic bank transfer, right? So the money would just appear, and he was always very consistent about it, always very reliable. And Wada-san would let her daughter see her dad whenever the dad wanted, like as long as it was reasonable. And it was important, I think, to notice that it wasn't actually a regular schedule. So it wasn't something like, oh, okay, I spend every weekend at my dad's, or I spend, you know, Monday to Wednesday at my dad's, and I go to my mom's. It was really, and I use this word advisedly, but it was really more casual than that. So when he had time to hang out with his daughter, they would set something up and they would go to an amusement park, or they would go and hang out on the weekend. So this worked for them. But I want to just emphasize a couple things. The first is that if Wada-san's ex-husband had wanted a more regular schedule, that might have created conflict, right? So the system is not set up for either spouse, but certainly a father, to say, hey, I want to see my kid, you know, 3 days a week or something like that. So part of what made this de facto shared custody possible is that they were both very generous with each other, right? So Wada-san didn't really ask for very much money. She was happy that it was consistently there, but it wasn't enough for her to live on. And her ex-husband didn't really ask for a lot of shared time with their daughter. He was happy with, you know, once a month, that kind of stuff, right? The other thing I wanted to just point out is that now that we've got these 2 divorced people who are in a relationship together with 4 children combined, they've actually never met each other's children or ex-partners, right? So they know about each other and it's all very friendly, but there also is still a pretty clear sense that like, well, why would I want it? It's just a little messy, or it's a little unnecessary. So we don't need to meet each other. I'm so happy that they're there. That's wonderful. But there's not a lot of overlap. So it's not the kind of, I'm imagining like a movie, like a big American, Thanksgiving with like all the siblings and, relatives and everybody sort of all crowded together. Any questions about their example? Okay. So the last one will probably be the most upsetting. So, and it's not too bad, but I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. So this is a person that I call Endo-san, and he's experiencing what I've labeled as a contested clean break. So he was married once before and got divorced, and then remarried a woman, and with her had a daughter. And I've only ever talked to him, so I've never met his wife. So I'm only getting his story. I want to emphasize that. He said that when their daughter was entering kindergarten, his wife started to experience some pretty significant mental illness. It seemed to him like it was exacerbated by the fact that his daughter they were trying to get her into a pretty good kindergarten and sort of elementary school. And his wife was insecure about her own educational background and felt unprepared to sort of help the daughter do the work she needed to do to get into this fancy school and then be a student at that school. So whether or not that's true, that's what he told me. So one day his wife leaves and says, I'm going to go visit my mom. And she does, and she doesn't come back. So he calls and the wife says, I'm going to stay here with my mom. I don't want to come home. And he's like, okay, do what you need to do. But this, of course, stretches longer and longer. It's months and then eventually years. So eventually Endo-san's wife files for divorce and asks for custody of the child, right, of their daughter. When you file for divorce in Japan, if you both agree, you turn in the form and it's over. But in this situation, Endo-san did not want the divorce. He refused to sign the paperwork because he wanted to have some shared custody of his daughter, right? He wanted to have some time. So it was a very prolonged negotiation, which is entirely typical in those kinds of situations. And he found that his wife would say, like, make promises and say one thing in the cholte, in the negotiation meeting, in the consultation with people there, and then she would just cancel, and so he would never get to see his daughter. So finally, he was fighting this for years, and just like saying, no, I want to see my daughter. I want to see my daughter. And finally, he decided, like, this is just not worth it, right? So what he decided to do instead was plan for the future. So his daughter was something like 8 years old when he finally agreed to the divorce. And his idea was, okay, I'm just going to work really hard and I'm going to save money for her, for my daughter, so that later in life, when she wants to come and find me, reach out to me, I will be prepared, and I will, have a lot of money that I can give her so that she knows how much I care about her. So this is the group that I'm doing some research with. I was doing some research with more recently, or he's part of a group that I was doing research with more recently. And there are lots of Japanese sort of texts now, or books. This is like just a popular, not popular in the sense that lots of people have read it, but popular in the sense that it's not a scholarly text. So this is I Can't See My Own Child, Fathers Who Are Lost After Divorce, a memoir of a father who is in a position, he's not Endo-san, but in a position like Endo-san. There are also books like this. So please forgive my really rough translation of the title and my rough gloss of the title, but Things I Want to Tell My Dad Who I Can't See or Who I Can't Meet. So this is a book that was written specifically for children who are in this position, right? For children who are processing a clean break. There's a lot more discussion now about the possible downsides of a clean break. And this is a book that was written actually by an NGO, or not written by an NGO, but published by an NGO specifically designed to try to help children work through that. So let me just give you a few statistics and then I'll stop. There's an online survey about joint custody, completely unscientific. And so in this TV survey, it was a panel discussion, like a wide show. And the topic was, should Japan have joint custody? In this survey, 77% of the people who called in or emailed in said yes, Japan should have joint custody. And yet, in a 2011 national survey of what divorced parents actually do, only 16 to 23% have visitation with a non-custodial parent. So this sort of maps on to my one-third thing, right? So in practice, of course, there's lots of different gaps here. The first is that this is a TV survey, like it's not scientific. The second thing is, I don't mean to sound harsh, but what people think they're going to do when they get divorced, hypothetically, and what they actually do when they're getting divorced can be really different, right? The situation can change, the stakes can be really high all of a sudden. So maybe that's part of what we're seeing here. But there is I think, a gap to some degree between what people think might be a good idea and then what the choices that they make in actual practice. And this is not because they're selfish or they're bad people necessarily. I think it's also precisely because there is no joint custody. And so people are making choices about how to protect their child, right? So just let me maybe end with a couple images. So this is an organization, and you can see in the green ribbon in the middle, it says stop child abduction and kids love both parents. Oh, and then there's also the English sign on the left. I'm sorry, I missed that. So this is a Japanese organization. There are a number of them. This is an event around Christmas, which is why they're dressed as Santa Clauses. That's not normal. And you can see that information table. That's one of the things that I was talking about earlier. So they're on these posters. They're showing examples of the poster on the right with all the pictures. They're showing examples of parents and children who are not in contact anymore, but want to be, right? So this is the contested clean break. And they're trying to educate parents about this reality. They also on the table, they're very clever, and they're handing out balloons. So they're trying to basically attract children and then also get the parents, right? So that they can inform the parents. And they're running a very unscientific survey as well and asking parents in this kind of situation, do you think there should be joint custody in Japan? When I was with them, many of the parents who would come over to the table didn't realize that there wasn't joint custody necessarily. Like it was an issue that it really felt informational to me as well. So here's an example. These are pictures taken in Yokohama right around Christmas. So just to let me conclude really briefly and say these are what I think is going on is these are public debates and also really important private conversations and discussions about first, what is best for children? Like what do children need after divorce? And then, as I said earlier, how might ongoing connection, specifically the connection with a non-custodial parent, help or harm children? So let me end there, and I might stop sharing my slides. I have other examples if you want to see them, but I think that should be a good place to stop if you don't mind. So I would be happy to hear any comments or questions. I know that divorce is, thank you for your little yellow applause hands. I appreciate it. Whenever I say something nice in class, my students give me little hearts and I'm like, oh my God, I totally respond to that. Apparently. Anyway, so I would be happy to hear any comments or questions. I know that it is a difficult topic. I know that we're all tired, but I would be happy to hear anything you care to share.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Strauss.
Take it, Pete. Sorry.
Okay, well, Dr. Alexy, thank you for coming. This is really interesting. And as Dr. Strauss knows, I love coming to these external events outside of class about Japan. I came a little bit late because I was at work, but I was wondering, would you mind maybe talking a little bit more about like the social implications of divorce, maybe with regard to like children or parents? Because I know, like particularly in regard to fathers, like their ability to get promoted is like significantly affected by divorce. And in regard for like children, it's like harder to get into certain schools if they're from a single parent home. Yeah, I don't know if would you mind just like saying what you know about that? That'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks for coming, especially after work. That's so nice of you.
Oh, of course, of course.
So yeah, you're right. One of the things I found was that in the course of this research, so I didn't mention this before the talk, so you didn't miss anything. Those realities were more true earlier. So like in the 1980s and 1990s, people my age, so I was in my late 20s, early 30s when I was doing this research, would talk, if their parents had gotten divorced, their parents would have stories like that. Like, so I include a moment in the book in chapter 5, I think, of my friend's mother whose parents had gotten divorced. And I can't remember what year, it's in the book, like the 70s or something. And she was absolutely positive that that's why she didn't get into the college that she wanted to get into. And it's completely reasonable. Like there's all sorts of evidence of, I think Kinokuniya, the bookstore in the 1980s had a policy of not hiring divorced people, like to be, you know, like working as a clerk in the shop. And it came out in some other lawsuit about something else, right? So that's completely what I expected. What I found was that the stigma about divorce is less than it used to be. So it's not zero, but it's less than it used to be. And instead, what people are facing after divorce is actually basically poverty, because of how hard it is, especially for women who are divorced, to get jobs that can, you know, they can live on, right? Let alone if they have children. So then they have to support children. So what I'm trying to do in chapter 5 of the book is to talk through. So the reality, there is still a stigma. So I'm not denying that there's a stigma, but that the actual tangle of getting divorced turns out to be more about financial need than, you know, like neighbors gossiping or something like that. Neighbors still gossip, and, you know, that still exists, absolutely. But the financial costs are really quite considerable. I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but some extraordinary number, like 72% of divorced women with children end up in the bottom 20% of annual salary. So like not extreme poverty in a technical sense, but like compared to the rest of the population, these people do not have a lot of money. They do not have a lot of income. And so I'm trying to explain basically how the labor market contributes to that. Does that answer your question, Pete? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Strauss, can I ask like a follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely. And Pete,
Okay.
I'm just going to say before you do, I'm going to stop recording now just because there's only 4 people left and I know all of them. So I'm